Alexander Graham Bell was a Scottish-born inventor and educator who became one of the most transformative figures in the history of human communication. Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone and pioneering teacher of the deaf, was born in Edinburgh, Scotland on March 3, 1847. He came from a family deeply involved in speech and elocution. He had a brilliant mind that ranged across multiple disciplines. Bell's early years were marked by curiosity and a profound interest in sound and human speech. He grew up in a household where communication was not just conversation but a science and an art form that shaped every aspect of daily life. Bell's father, Alexander Melville Bell, was a renowned professor of elocution and speech who developed a system called visible speech, a phonetic alphabet that used symbols to represent the position of the throat, tongue, and lips in making sounds. His mother, Eliza Grace Simmons Bell, was deaf, a fact that profoundly influenced young Alexander's life and career. His grandfather, also named Alexander Bell, was likewise an elocutionist and speech teacher in London. This family legacy of working with speech and sound created an environment where young Bell's talents could flourish. As a child, Bell was curious and inventive but not particularly distinguished as a student. He attended Royal High School in Edinburgh but left at age 15 without graduating. His education was informal in many ways, shaped more by his family's intellectual environment than by traditional schooling. He and his brothers conducted experiments and built devices, encouraged by their father to explore and question. One early invention, created when Bell was just 12 years old, was a simple dehusking machine for wheat that he built with his brother for a neighbor who operated a grain mill. Bell's interest in sound was partly inspired by his mother's deafness. He learned to speak clearly and slowly so she could read his lips, and he would place his mouth close to her forehead so she could feel the vibrations of his voice. This intimate understanding of how sound could be perceived through vibration would later inform his work on acoustic devices. The connection between sound, vibration, and communication became the central theme of his intellectual life. In 1862, Bell went to live with his grandfather in London for a year, an experience that transformed him. His grandfather was a demanding teacher who insisted on rigorous self-improvement and intellectual discipline. Under his guidance, the young Bell matured intellectually and developed the habits of study and inquiry that would serve him throughout his life. When he returned to Edinburgh, he was a changed young man, more serious and focused on his future. Bell briefly attended the University of Edinburgh and later University College London, studying anatomy and physiology. His formal education was interrupted repeatedly by family circumstances and his own health issues, but he continued to educate himself through reading and experimentation. He became particularly interested in the work of Hermann von Helmholtz, a German scientist who had conducted experiments on sound and resonance. Bell's imperfect understanding of German led him to believe that Helmholtz had transmitted vowel sounds by telegraph, an achievement that Helmholtz had not actually accomplished. This misunderstanding, however, planted the seed of an idea that would eventually lead to the telephone. Tragedy struck the Bell family in the 1860s. Both of Alexander's brothers died of tuberculosis, a disease that ravaged many families in the 19th century. Edward died in 1867 and Melville in 1870. The deaths devastated the family and raised concerns about Alexander's own health, as he too showed signs of the disease. Hoping that a change of climate might save their remaining son, Alexander Melville Bell decided to emigrate to Canada. In 1870, the Bell family moved to Brantford, Ontario, where they purchased a property they called Melville House. The Canadian climate and environment did indeed improve Alexander's health. He spent time recuperating and helping his father with work on visible speech. Within a year, however, Bell's restless energy and ambition led him to seek opportunities in the United States. In 1871, he moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where he began teaching at the Boston School for Deaf Mutes. Bell's work with deaf students became a central part of his life and identity. He was a passionate and effective teacher who believed that deaf individuals could be taught to speak rather than relying solely on sign language. This philosophy, known as oralism, was controversial then and remains so today. Bell believed that teaching deaf people to speak and read lips would better integrate them into hearing society. His critics argued that this approach denied deaf people their own language and culture. Despite the controversy, Bell's dedication to his students was genuine and his methods were often successful. In Boston, Bell quickly established himself as an expert in teaching speech to the deaf. He opened his own school, the School of Vocal Physiology and Mechanics of Speech, and also taught at the American School for the Deaf. He became a professor of vocal physiology at Boston University in 1873. His work brought him into contact with wealthy families who sought his help for their deaf children, connections that would prove significant for his future work. It was during this period that Bell began his experiments with acoustic telegraphy and sound transmission. The telegraph had revolutionized long-distance communication, but it could only send one message at a time over a wire. Bell and other inventors were working on a harmonic telegraph that could send multiple messages simultaneously by using different frequencies. Bell's unique background in sound and speech gave him insights that pure electricians lacked. He understood acoustics and resonance in ways that informed his experimental work. Bell's experiments were constrained by limited resources. He was a teacher, not a wealthy inventor with a laboratory and staff. He conducted his experiments in rented rooms and borrowed facilities, often working late into the night after his teaching duties were finished. He needed financial backing to pursue his ideas, and he found it through the families of two of his students. Gardner Green Hubbard, whose deaf daughter Mabel was Bell's student, and Thomas Sanders, whose deaf son George was also taught by Bell, agreed to finance his experiments in exchange for shares in any resulting inventions. Mabel Hubbard became much more than a student to Bell. Despite an age difference of 10 years, Bell fell in love with her. Mabel had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at age 5 but had learned to speak and read lips. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and from a prominent Boston family. Her father initially opposed the relationship, partly because of the age difference and partly because Bell was an impoverished teacher with uncertain prospects. However, Bell persisted, and eventually, Mabel returned his affection. They became engaged in 1875, though they would not marry until after Bell's breakthrough invention had secured his financial future. Bell's crucial assistant in his experiments was Thomas Watson, a young machinist and electrician who worked at an electrical shop where Bell purchased supplies. Watson had the technical skills to build the devices that Bell designed. The two men formed an effective partnership, with Bell providing the theoretical understanding and Watson the practical execution. They worked together for long hours, testing different designs and configurations, experiencing countless failures for every small success. The breakthrough came on June 2, 1875, during experiments with the harmonic telegraph. Watson was in one room working with the transmitting equipment while Bell was in another room with the receiving equipment. Watson accidentally plucked a reed that was stuck to its electromagnet. In the other room, Bell heard the sound transmitted over the wire. It was not speech, just a twanging sound, but it was a sound transmitted electrically, not just an electrical pulse. Bell immediately understood the significance. If one sound could be transmitted, all sounds could be transmitted, including human speech. Bell and Watson worked feverishly to develop a device that could transmit speech. Bell designed a transmitter that used a membrane attached to a needle that would vary an electrical current in response to sound waves striking the membrane. The varying current would travel through a wire to a receiver where it would cause another membrane to vibrate, reproducing the original sound. The theory was sound, but making it work in practice required months of experimentation and refinement. On March 10, 1876, Bell transmitted the first intelligible sentence over his device. The famous words "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you" were spoken into the transmitter in one room and heard by Watson in another. The telephone had been invented. The moment was not as dramatic as legend sometimes suggests. Watson heard the words, but they were faint and distorted. However, they were understandable, which proved the principle worked. Bell and Watson continued to improve the device, increasing its range and clarity. Bell had filed a patent application for the telephone on February 14, 1876, just hours before a rival inventor, Elisha Gray, filed a caveat for a similar device. This timing would lead to years of legal disputes over who truly invented the telephone. Bell's patent, number 174,465, was granted on March 7, 1876, 3 days before the first successful transmission of speech. the patent would become one of the most valuable in history and the most legally contested. Bell publicly demonstrated his telephone at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in June 1876. The demonstration created a sensation. The Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II, who was touring the exposition, famously exclaimed, "My God, it talks," after listening to Bell recite Hamlet through the device. The demonstration brought Bell national and international attention. Scientific journals reported on the invention. Newspapers wrote articles about the miraculous device that could transmit speech over wires. Despite the excitement, turning the telephone into a commercial success required capital, organization, and business acumen that Bell lacked. In 1877, Bell, Hubbard, Sanders, and Watson formed the Bell Telephone Company. Bell married Mabel Hubbard in July 1877, and the couple used shares in the telephone company as their primary asset. For their honeymoon, Bell took Mabel to Europe where he demonstrated the telephone and established his reputation as a world-famous inventor. The telephone business grew rapidly but also faced intense competition and legal challenges. Western Union, the telegraph giant, entered the telephone business using designs by Edison and Gray. Hundreds of other inventors claimed to have invented the telephone first or independently. Bell and his partners were forced to defend their patent in court repeatedly. Over the next 18 years, the Bell Company was involved in more than 600 lawsuits over the telephone patent. Bell himself testified in many of these cases, defending his claim to the invention. The courts consistently ruled in Bell's favor, upholding his patent. The legal battles were stressful and time-consuming, but they were successful. By the time the Bell patents expired in the 1890s, the Bell Telephone Company had established a dominant position in the telecommunications industry. The company would eventually evolve into AT&T, one of the largest corporations in American history. Bell himself profited enormously from the telephone, becoming a wealthy man while still in his 30s. Financial security allowed Bell to pursue other interests and inventions. He never saw himself solely as the inventor of the telephone. His mind ranged across multiple fields, and he continued to experiment and invent throughout his life. He worked on devices to help deaf people perceive sound through vibrations. He experimented with metal detectors, creating a device to locate bullets in the human body. He developed an early audiometer for testing hearing. He worked on techniques for desalinating seawater and for air conditioning. Bell's interest in flight led him to conduct extensive experiments with kites and aircraft. He founded the Aerial Experiment Association in 1907, which brought together young engineers and inventors to develop flying machines. The association built several aircraft, including the Silver Dart, which made the first powered flight in Canada in 1909. Bell's tetrahedral kite designs were innovative if ultimately impractical, but they demonstrated his willingness to explore unconventional approaches to engineering problems. Bell was also deeply involved in work with the deaf throughout his life. He never abandoned teaching even after becoming famous and wealthy. He continued to work with deaf students and to advocate for oralist education methods. In 1890, he helped found the American Association to promote the teaching of speech to the deaf. He provided financial support to organizations working with the deaf and funded research into hereditary deafness. However, Bell's views on deafness extended into troubling territory. He became concerned about what he saw as the formation of a deaf community and culture, which he believed would lead to a deaf variety of the human race. He opposed deaf people marrying each other and advocated for measures to prevent what he called the formation of a deaf race. These views, which he outlined in a paper titled Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race, reflected the eugenics thinking common among many educated people of his era. This aspect of Bell's legacy is deeply problematic and has made him a controversial figure in deaf history. Bell and Mabel had 4 children, though 2 sons died in infancy. Their 2 daughters, Elsie and Marion, survived to adulthood. Bell was a devoted if sometimes distracted father. His mind was always working on some problem or invention, and he often worked through the night, sleeping during the day. Mabel managed the household and their social obligations, serving as Bell's partner in every sense. She reviewed his papers, managed his correspondence, and provided crucial support for his work. In 1885, the Bell family began spending summers at Bain-Braa, a property they purchased near Bad Deck, Nova Scotia. The estate became Bell's primary residence and laboratory in his later years. There he conducted his experiments with kites, aircraft, and boats. He built laboratories and workshops and employed numerous assistants. Bain-Braa became a center of innovation where Bell pursued his wide-ranging interests surrounded by family and colleagues. Bell received numerous honors and awards during his lifetime. He was awarded the French Volta Prize in 1880 for the invention of the telephone, using the prize money to establish the Volta Laboratory in Washington, D.C. He received honorary degrees from universities around the world. He was a founding member of the National Geographic Society and served as its president from 1898 to 1903. His support helped transform National Geographic magazine into the influential publication it remains today. Throughout his later years, Bell remained active and engaged with the world. He corresponded with scientists and inventors. He testified before government committees on various technical matters. He continued to experiment and to pursue new ideas. His laboratory notebooks from this period show a mind that never stopped questioning and exploring. Bell's health began to decline in 1922. He had been diagnosed with diabetes, a serious condition in an era before insulin treatment was available. He spent his final months at Bain-Braa, surrounded by family. On August 2, 1922, Alexander Graham Bell died at his beloved estate. He was 75 years old. Mabel was with him at the end, as she had been throughout their 45-year marriage. Bell's funeral was held at Bain-Braa. At the moment of his burial, telephone service across North America was suspended for 1 minute in tribute to the man who had invented the device. It was a fitting honor for someone who had transformed human communication. Bell was buried on the summit of Bain-Braa Mountain, overlooking the estate where he had spent his happiest years. Bell's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He is remembered primarily as the inventor of the telephone, a device that fundamentally changed human civilization by making instant long-distance communication possible. The telephone shrank the world, enabling people separated by vast distances to speak to one another as if they were in the same room. It transformed business, politics, social relationships, and emergency services. It was arguably the most important communication technology between the printing press and the Internet. Yet Bell never wanted to be remembered solely for the telephone. He saw himself as a teacher of the deaf who happened to invent a useful device. His work in education and his efforts to help deaf people communicate were, in his own estimation, more important than his inventions. This aspect of his legacy is complicated by his controversial views on deaf marriage and deaf culture, views that many in the deaf community today find offensive. Bell's other inventions and innovations, while less famous than the telephone, were significant. His work on the photophone, a device that transmitted sound on a beam of light, anticipated fiber optic communication by a century. His metal detector saved lives. His aviation experiments contributed to the development of flight. His support for scientific research and education had lasting impacts. Modern historians recognize Bell as a genius whose talents ranged across multiple disciplines. He was an inventor, teacher, scientist, and entrepreneur. He had the rare ability to combine theoretical understanding with practical application. His background in speech and acoustics gave him insights that pure electricians lacked, while his willingness to work with skilled technicians like Watson allowed him to turn theory into working devices. The controversies over who truly invented the telephone have never entirely disappeared. Elisha Gray supporters argue that his design was filed the same day as Bell's patent application and may have been superior. Antonio Meucci, an Italian inventor, claimed to have invented a telephone years earlier but lacked the resources to patent it. The U.S. House of Representatives passed a resolution in 2002 recognizing Meucci's contributions. However, the historical consensus remains that Bell was the first to patent a practical telephone and the first to make it a commercial reality. Bell himself was sometimes uncomfortable with the fame and wealth the telephone brought him. He worried that being known only as the telephone's inventor diminished his other work. He once said that the telephone had been a millstone around his neck because it overshadowed everything else he did. Yet he defended his patent rights vigorously and profited substantially from the invention. In the end, Alexander Graham Bell was a man of extraordinary talents who lived during a period of rapid technological change and contributed significantly to that change. He was a product of his time, with both the virtues and prejudices common to educated men of the Victorian and Edwardian eras. His work improved millions of lives through better communication. His teaching helped thousands of deaf students learn to speak. His inventions and innovations pushed forward human knowledge and capability. Bell represents a particular type of inventor, one who combined scientific knowledge with practical experimentation and who was willing to pursue ideas across disciplinary boundaries. His success came from his unique background in speech and sound, his partnership with skilled technicians, his access to financial backing, and his persistence in the face of technical challenges and legal obstacles. His story demonstrates how innovation emerges from the intersection of knowledge, opportunity, and determination. Alexander Graham Bell died nearly a century ago, but his influence persists. Every time we make a phone call, we use technology that descends directly from his invention. The telecommunications industry he helped create has evolved far beyond anything he could have imagined, but it rests on the foundation he laid. He was a teacher, inventor, and visionary who changed the world and whose legacy, despite its complexities and controversies, remains profound and enduring.